That was quite an introduction, and I'm not quite sure I can live up to it, but I will certainly do my best. It is an honor to be here, and as the Justice said, it really is extraordinary to see the wide range of all of you present. I know you have incredibly challenging jobs that you do every day, and to have you devote your day to this conversation is a testament to the state. So I'm really a civil rights lawyer. I've been a civil rights lawyer for 25 years, and I started this work. I'm from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. It's one of the more segregated cities in this country. I never understood why as a child, and have devoted my adult life to trying to be part, as all of you are, of making something different, of creating the society that we envision. 7 years ago, some answers started to emerge to what was otherwise a paradox. For the most part in this country, everyone believes that racism is wrong. To be a racist is to be immoral. In fact, in studies across the country, people rate being a racist as only a close second to being a pedophile. I'm completely serious. This is in every state in the union. To be a racist is to be immoral. And clearly everyone who is here is devoted to the ideals of fairness, to the ideals of equality, as the Justice so eloquently described. This is a shared commitment. And yet, 7 years ago, when my particular journey into the mind sciences began, it was very, again, paradoxical. It was confusing. Why, despite the stated values that we share, do we continue to see behaviors and outcomes that seem inconsistent with those values? One possible hypothesis is that white people are lying. We say that we don't believe in racism, but we're just hiding the truth. I would submit that every white person here would say that is an affront to my basic values and to my dignity as a person, and it would be deeply upsetting for anyone here to think that that's true. And again, the research, my experience, probably all of your experiences, it would be deeply hurtful for the white people to hear, to think that everyone here assumes that they're just lying. You're just here as a pose. And yet, I would also submit that every person of color here has experienced more times than you'd like to share with everyone else, so many experiences that seem contrary to the stated values that we whites claim to have. So again, what explains this paradox? How can those two things be true? The mind sciences actually offer us an answer. It is in fact possible for people of every race and ethnicity, for the most part, except for, I think they estimate around 10%, all of whom are on the internet all the time. So their voices ring very loud and create a perception that those voices are loud, powerful, and in number and in scope. But for the most part, there is an authentic, genuine commitment to non-racism, to equality, that really is deeply held. And yet, because of what happens in our unconscious brain, our actions often don't reflect our values. And so the experiences that the people of color in this room and across this country have are genuine. And as a white person, part of what our job is we have to grapple with this. And we have to do some of the navigation that, frankly, we've left to people of color to do. We've said, we are going to be colorblind. How many of you are Stephen Colbert fans? I don't see race, right? Look, I don't see race. I don't see race. Well, yeah, you do. And that's not a bad thing. It is not racist to notice that people have different races and ethnicities. It's not sexist for you to say, I think she's a woman, right? Neither of those things are the problem. And yet, in a sense, what whites are told and what we think Dr. King wanted from us was a kind of colorblindness that's actually made it harder to have these conversations. And the mind sciences can help us unlock this paradox and move to a different place and have a different conversation. And so again, this work for me started 7 years ago with someone I'll show his picture at the end because he's influenced me so much, John Powell, who some of you may have seen. He's a civil rights icon. And he introduced me to social scientists who've been doing this work. And suddenly, it was as though a light had gone on. It was an answer to the paradox and a beginning, ideally, of an answer to some solutions. But I have to say, and I think everyone here knows this, we are in a different place now, very significantly, than we were 7 years ago. 7 years ago, you'll all recall, Barack Obama had just been elected president. There was hope. There was a feeling of unity. There was a very strong, positive feeling across the country about where we could be and who we could be. And right now, there's a very different feeling. So I spent this summer working with community groups across the country, and I have to say, the depths of the pain and the grief and the fear that I saw, particularly in the men and women, African-American men and women I worked with, was as more profound than anything I've ever seen in 25 years of work. A woman in one of the workshops I was in broke down in tears and said, "Have I done wrong by bringing my son into the world?" And at the same time, my work with police officers and with prosecutors and with judges, I'm hearing something that kind of echoes that sentiment. We're not Ferguson. We're putting ourselves on the line every day to protect our communities. We don't want to be the image that people have of us. And yet we can see it when someone looks in our, sees our uniform and looks at us. They see evil. They see racism. And we don't know what to do. We don't want to be that person. Our department doesn't want to be that department. And so we're in this moment where these feelings are genuine. And we keep seeing on both sides these images that cause immense pain. And we have to move to a different place. Because that pain that men and women are feeling, that fear on behalf of their children, that's not a place we can sustain. And we similarly can't sustain a place where police officers feel as though everyone who sees them, whatever their race or ethnicity, you're a cause not for good. You're not here to protect me, but you're potentially here to harm me. That's not sustainable. And that's not where most people are. And so the question is how, and again, it's wonderful, it's amazing to see this group coming together, people from all different places within the criminal justice system, from all different life experiences, races, and ethnicities, coming together to have this conversation and learning, hopefully, some insights from the mind sciences that will help you do the work in Connecticut that clearly Connecticut has been devoted to for quite a long time. So I spent a little bit of time looking at what the work the commission has done, and as the justice said, Connecticut has been on the forefront of recognizing the importance of this work, and absolutely is to be commended for that work. There is clearly a commitment to altering what currently is the case both in Connecticut and elsewhere, that a child of color walks through education, walks through the streets, walks through the halls of the school, walks into hospitals, walks into the criminal justice system, and experiences it very differently than a white child who's otherwise similarly situated. Those are different experiences. And that is searing for those children, and that's not what anybody here wants. That's why you're here. No one here wants that to be the case. But again, the question is, so how do we move to a different place? And why don't we know how? And part of the answer is a lot of it is very counterintuitive. So this is a slide some of you may recognize if you were here at the last event that you had. And this tells us quite graphically what's been documented by research in every state in the union. Kids of color are not expelled because their behavior is different than white kids. Kids of color are not in the justice system at vastly disproportionate rates because there's violence and crime levels that are very different. The research is absolutely clear about that. The white kid is, oh, thank you. The white kid is, shoplifting and, maybe gets noticed, maybe doesn't. If he or she does get noticed, parent is called, apology is made, and life goes on, lesson learned. The child of color has the same experience. The police are called, a contact with the criminal justice system occurs. A white kid acts obnoxious in school one day, the teacher settles him or her down, perhaps calls the parent, perhaps in school, loses recess, and that's the end of the incident, and hopefully lesson learned. A child of color, exact same actions, perhaps contact with the criminal justice system. And again, that's not an outcome anyone here wants. No one wants to think that because of the color of a child's face, his or her experience in school is going to be different. His or her experience in a store is going to be different. No one wants that. And the question is, how do we get to the place where we can trust, where every mother here can trust what I can trust, which is that when my daughters go into a store, when they're in their school, they make a childlike mistake, they will be treated as a child ought to be treated. Every parent here should be able to have that same confidence. When a police officer walks up to me or stops me in my car, I know I will be treated with the utmost respect and consideration, and I always am. And every person here should feel absolutely as confident as I do. And every police officer here clearly wants that to be the case. So the question is, again, how do we get to that place when there's a shared commitment to getting to that place? And again, if there's this shared commitment, why aren't we there yet? So now I'll take a step back, and hopefully we'll start to get more of a sense of how we can have these contradicting realities and contradicting intentions and behaviors. This is going to require group engagement. Everyone ready? I cannot do this one alone. I need group engagement. I need you to be ready, jump in, and be loud. So what my ask is that you state the color of the text. Everyone with me? Let's do a try. Okay, ready? Everyone good on blue? Some people say that really looks purple, and I'm sorry about that. But let's go with blue. Okay, so we'll start again. So loud. Blue, red, green, black, green, red, black. All right. So we saw what happened. Right? We were rolling along. We got kind of loud. We were in unison. It was, and that was good. And then all of a sudden something changed. So we're going to try this again. And I'm going to move a little bit more slowly. So ready, one more time. Blue, red, green, black, green, black, red. She's good. Okay. Now everyone stop. Just stop. Concentrate really hard. And let's get the last few right, okay? Concentrate. And you have to concentrate really hard, right? All right, so last few. Ready? Blue, black. Yes. So you have just experienced automaticity and your brain having a conflict between your intentions and what you've been trained to do your whole life. Right? We have been trained to read those words our entire lives. Think about our kids. Like, they're all learning how to read in pre-K. For them, this is going to be even harder. I learned to read when I was in first grade. I don't know about the rest of you, but they're changing that. We're learning to read much earlier now. It's going to be even harder. We have been trained to read the words. It's automatic. When we got to the black text that said red, it all broke apart. Because everyone just read the word. That's what we do. And this is called the Stroop test, and it's used in social psychology for so many different things. But what it is a wonderful example of, obviously without any political salience whatsoever, is our conscious brains, our executive brains, we can intend to do one thing, and yet when we go into automatic mode, which we do instinctively, we do what our automatic brain tells us because our automatic brain is a lot more powerful than our executive brain. So I've got one other instance in which I'd like you to try this
This is an awareness test. How many passes does the team in white make? The answer is 13.
Yes, excellent.
But did you see the moonwalking bear?
So I know, because I heard some giggles, some of you weren't counting. Am I right? Because it is impossible to simultaneously count the passes and to see the bear. And so I know some of you weren't counting, and I particularly know because my mother came to one of my presentations and literally in the middle of that, she said, "Look at the bear!" It's like, are you kidding me? She doesn't follow directions well. She never has. So that was another example of, again, snort. Great. All right, yes, we're good. I'm gonna have to. So this is another example of the difficulty of simultaneously having our brain encompass and address everything before us. And how is this relevant to race, you may be wondering? You might have thought when you saw the basketball that that had something to do with race. That's what I did the first time. I was like waiting for the racial implications of that, but there wasn't. It's really a counting exercise. So what does this have to do with race? It has everything to do with how we respond to the world. Our brain, we cannot function as humans if we don't organize the world into categories and develop sort of clever, unconscious heuristics to respond to everyday life. How many of you, we're in Connecticut, so I'm guessing everyone, how many of you here drive a car? How many of you drive manual? The first time you drove a car, it was really difficult, right? To actually put your foot on the gas, look around, not hit anyone. I don't know about any of you, have your mother or father or whoever's teaching you yelling at you, and it seemed impossible. For those of us who learned how to drive manual rather, it seemed really impossible to go up a hill and to actually manage to get up that hill without stalling. All of that seemed so difficult. And yet once it's learned, it's obviously completely automatic, and you don't think or have to think at all about what you're doing. Now, how is that possible? It's possible because all of our automatic brain is in operation, is working for us while we're having the conversation with the person next to us, hopefully not texting. I have police officers here, so I'm sure that there's a lot of admonitions against that. So our brains do this extraordinary work, and the automaticity which makes it possible for us to function in the world is precisely what makes race difficult. So we've got, again, and I'll be sharing these slides, by the way, so you don't need to worry if you haven't gotten every bit of the text. Our automatic brain, which processes 40 million bits of information per minute, no, actually, I'm sorry, it's 11 million bits of information per minute, while our conscious brain processes 40. Our automatic brain is doing this extraordinary work and allowing us to function, and yet we do the same thing with people that we do with objects, and we have to. We divide people into groups, and most of the time that is also functional. Like, very interesting how quickly children figure out, even if they don't know cognitively, who the principal is. Like, within a day, they know that there's someone called the principal who, when that principal walks into the room, everyone gets quiet, their teacher looks a little bit nervous, and everything is different. So we, through osmosis, figure out all these different categories of people and what the appropriate response is to those people. That's what our brain does. And again, most of the time that's functional. We want to know who the bus driver is, so if someone who's not the bus driver is driving the bus, we don't get on it, because that would be dangerous. Someone's driving off with the bus. We want to know who the doctor is. We want to know who's a senior citizen, so we should offer that person a subway chair. We want to know who a child is so we know who we can protect. But at the same time, there are categories, and this of course includes gender and race and age and religion when we're aware of it. There are certain categories that have associations linked to them that cause our reactions to be deeply problematic. Now, you may wonder why I have this strange sketch up here. That is a sketch from the 19th century, and it's comparing Irish women and English women. I'm Irish, so I find this really interesting and spent a fair amount of time with Irish history. So in the 19th century, and some of you may be Irish, anyone else Irish here? So some of you may know this history, right? The Irish were assumed by others to be savage, uneducable, women were promiscuous, and we were all drunk. And those associations were real. Those associations, we were assumed to be, to some degree, subhuman in the 19th century. And those associations had real effects on people's daily lives. What everyone here also knows is, first of all, you probably had no idea I was Irish. I had a judge once who wouldn't believe me. He said, "You're not a lawyer, you're not Irish, you're a social worker, and you're Jewish." And I said, "I'd be happy to be either of those things, but we can go to Ireland, we can meet my relatives, and you can see my law degree and my course transcript if you'd like." He embarrassed his colleagues a bit. But again, the fact that I'm Irish is basically irrelevant to anyone but me. The associations, except for perhaps the drunk one, which people still think is just kind of cute, the negative associations are basically gone. So sometimes when I describe this bit of history, people will either say or think, well, why can't other groups just do what the Irish did? Well, the answer to that is in the title of a book. The Irish became white. Right? There was a time in our country where the Irish, the Germans, the French, the Swedes, we were all different races. But then we were all collapsed into one big category. And that one big category is pretty capacious, but it doesn't include African Americans, it doesn't include Asian Americans, it doesn't include people who are now understood to be Latino, doesn't include Native Americans, and the associations and the stereotypes linked with people who fit into those groups, as we all know, have not disappeared. They are not funny. We can't giggle at the idea of the Irish, which, again, I can now, but even my parents don't giggle quite as much. My grandparents certainly not at all, because it was real to them and it affected their lives. So what we have are these schemas, these categories into which we put people. We have associations and traits that we link with those categories. When those associations are positive, we call them preferences. So we may say Asian Americans, for example, there's a positive association of someone who's Asian American with math facility. Now, some of you who may have heard Jerry Kong, very good friend of mine, phenomenal speaker, Jerry begins every presentation by saying, okay, you're looking at me and you're thinking, guy's Asian. Not sure what group, but he's Asian. Probably got a perfect score on his math SAT. Probably has a black belt in some martial art. Probably played the violin at Carnegie Hall when he was 7. And then Jerry says, and 2 of those things are true. And there are these certain positive associations, but Jerry did a powerful study called Are Litigators White, where he and his colleagues had prospective jurors listen to a deposition from the same male voice. And half of the jurors thought that that person was like, John Smith or whatever the name was. It was very kind of bland and whitish sounding, and the image of him was just kind of a regular 35-year-old guy, nice enough looking. The other half thought the person's name was Sung Chang, and also nice enough looking guy, mid-30s. And then they asked some questions to the people who heard the deposition. Remember, same deposition. The people who heard John Smith thought, oh, he's assertive, he's a good lawyer, he represents my interests, I'd hire this guy. Curiously, the people who heard the exact same deposition, with the only difference being the name and a little bit of the face, didn't think he was sufficiently assertive for him to represent their interests and found him cold. There are certain associations linked to Asian Americans that are constricting. That with respect to some occupations, like lawyer, are not in their interest. So, and of course, what's powerful about that study is there's no other explanation for those adjectives applied or those perceptions of this person except the ethnicity, because it was the same voice. And the people with the high implicit bias levels, and we'll talk about that in a minute, their sort of strength of feeling about Sung Chang versus John Smith were the highest. So what we have are a set of stereotypes and myths about different racial and ethnic groups that have been powerfully sort of pervade throughout the culture for decades, and that we've imbibed whether we agree with them consciously or not. We hear them all the time. So with respect to Latinos, there are all sorts of assumptions about someone who appears Latino, about their education level, about where they come from. If a person who appears Latino is so frequently asked, and where are you from? Similarly, someone who's Asian American, and where are you from? Boston. No, where are you really from? I'm really from Boston. And that question seems innocuous, except if you're asked the question all the time, what is it telling you about whether or not you're seen as a citizen, whether or not you're seen as a member of the country? So again, with respect to Latinos, there's these assumptions made, and I'll talk a little bit more about the effect of that. With respect to African Americans, it's very interesting when we think about poverty, for example. Our country is known for not having strong math skills. So there's the assumption made that if I were to ask most people in this country, what is the largest number of poor people? What race does the largest number of poor people in our country fit? Most people, if they were being honest, would say, we think it's African Americans. It is not. It is white people by a factor of 9 million. Latinos are next, actually. African Americans are third. In New York City, Asian Americans are actually the most likely to be poor. So we have this idea of who's poor and who receives government benefits that are absolutely contrary to reality. So I got Medicaid and sort of what was called welfare when I was a kid. But no one looking at me would ever think, she's just a white lawyer. How could that have been the case? Well, my mom didn't have a job, and my dad was a roofer, and times were hard. But no one ever looks at me and thinks that, because that's just not what happens to white people. But that's completely wrong. We are the largest number of recipients of these programs because we're the most likely to, the largest number of poor people. And yet no one knows that, because this perception through images, through tables that's put out creates a certain set of associations. And as a result of these associations, and obviously the most dangerous is the association the justice referred to of African American men and boys particularly with criminality. That's the most dangerous, of course. Others are harmful too, but that's the most dangerous. When we have certain associations, just like we heard with that interesting litigator study, we process what we see to confirm what we assume to be true. So the fancy, scientific term for it is confirmation bias. So if you see an image of two kids wrestling, if you see two white kids wrestling, they're playing around, they're wrestling. If you see a black kid and a white kid wrestling, is someone harming someone? If you see a picture of someone pushing and someone else standing there, and it's, again, two white kids, they're playing tag. If you see a picture of a push and a black kid and a white kid, is one harming the other? So again, none of this is conscious and none of this is intentionally racist, but if that's what we're seeing, then we respond accordingly. And this is the heart of what implicit bias is it's a set of unconscious associations and attitudes. And I'm going to emphasize unconscious. As you know, the word implicit means unconscious. So people really don't know that they're seeing something through a different lens. But we are, and we're responding accordingly. And so that going back to my first hypothesis about what explains this disjuncture between values and behavior, maybe it's lying, but the evidence very strongly suggests that it's not, that white people are lying. This implicit bias, this implicit set of associations is really powerful. And of course, it's not just held by white people, as probably everyone here knows. every one of us, as the justice said, has some set of associations and attitudes that we hold toward other groups, every single one of us. I will absolutely admit that if you say engineer, I think man. Just kind of the image that comes to mind. So we all have them towards some group or another. And how do we know which ones we have? Well, there's now an interesting way that we can actually learn. You can Google Project Implicit, and you can take this interest, they call it a test. I think that's actually kind of a problematic word, but it's an exercise that allows you to see kind of your unconscious brain in action. And how many of you have taken the implicit association test? All right, so a big number of you. It's very interesting. It's premised on this question of, can we as quickly associate positive words with one group as we can with another? And it was constructed originally by a social psychologist named Tony Greenwald using flowers and bugs, and really gross bugs, like cockroaches, not like ladybugs. And the question that he had was, could he train himself, and apparently he's very bug averse and he likes flowers, could he train himself to press a button when the word beautiful came up and it was a picture of a cockroach? Could he train himself to do that as quickly as he could when a picture of a flower came up? And he did it over and over again, left hand, right hand, starting one, starting the other way. He could never train himself to as quickly press the button when it said beautiful and it was a picture of a water bug. Couldn't do it. His revulsion was too strong. And so that's what this test essentially does, is it allows you to uncover what automatic associations do you have. Again, mine, male, engineer, I know that. So it would take me longer if female engineer to press that button. And it's that time lapse that helps you understand these automatic reactions. So it's interesting, worthwhile to understand reactions you have. Again, there's a whole range of tests for all sorts of different comparative groups. And then the next question is, what do you do about it? Does that mean it's fixed? Does that mean you're forever bound to act on those implicit biases? Absolutely not. In the same way that when we slowed down, we were all able to state the color of the text rather than read the word, if you're able to be cognizant that you need to slow down, right? That's the first thing. That's why the colorblindness thing is actually dangerous. Because if we're told we should be colorblind, we're told we shouldn't see difference, then we're trying really hard not to notice difference, but we are anyway, and our brain can't process properly. If we acknowledge and recognize we're noticing difference, I'm seeing different shades of people in this room. They're beautiful shades. I don't feel guilty about seeing different shades. Noticing the different hues, the different facial features people have, and knowing that perhaps you have to be mindful when a group against whom you have bias comes before you, allows you to act according to your values. So there's a very easy answer if you can move slowly. But we have police officers here. I'm sure the police officers are thinking, what on earth am I going to do if you're expecting me to like sleepwalk through the streets, thinking slowly and carefully and looking for every detail? That's not realistic, right? For judges, sure, but not for police officers. So the work that has to be done, and frankly, we're still at the beginning of this work, the work that has to be done with and for police officers is to help develop another set of criteria that you can react to just as automatically. So race doesn't serve as a proxy. And again, we know you want to do that, but that's work we need to do collectively. What is it we should be noticing that's reasonable for us to notice? And the other thing that's, of course, important is it's not just on the police officers. I've been working with this group of police officers from Wisconsin recently, and they're saying to me, we get these calls from people in neighborhoods who say, there's something really suspicious happening in my neighborhood. You have to send a cruiser right now. Well, what do you see, sir or ma'am? Well, there's a teenager with a hoodie walking down the street. Okay, ma'am, anything else? Well, they don't want to say, and he's black. The police officer knows that he is because there's a white teenager with the hoodie walking down the street. They would think it was their kid's friend. And then the police officer's in a conundrum. What do? You just got a call from someone reporting suspicious activity. What do you do? So it's not just on the police officers. It's on the whole community. It's on all of us. So the IAT, the implicit association test, is not a DNA test. It does not dictate how you will behave. It simply tells you what you should be mindful of. So it is helpful in that sense, but it is not prescriptive. It's not telling you who you are. This is not a "are you racist" test. This is a "what associations have you taken from the culture that you need to be worried about?" And you might be questioning, does it link to behavior? Well, I gave you an example from the litigator test. Yes, it turns out, big surprise, our automatic associations predict behavior better than our stated explicit values for the reasons that you all now know, because your automatic brain is just more powerful. So we've got a lot of research showing judicial attitudes, express attitudes, egalitarian, implicit biases, more predictive of behavior. We have, budget cuts by students. We have, and I'm going to talk about this one in a little bit of detail, treatment recommendations by doctors, voting policy attitudes. The number of studies on hiring, you probably have heard of some of these. You have a resume that has a name. You have Emily versus Lakeisha, same resume. Emily gets lots of callbacks and Lakeisha doesn't. This was a study that was done a few years ago, Jamal versus Joshua or something. What's really interesting is we've had some new versions of this to try and figure out, is this really implicit or is this just, straighten out racial bias? And some of the new versions do clever things. They have and actually I'll give one anecdotal story that's been replicated in studies. So a student of mine was the president of the Black Law Students Association, and his first name's Tyrone. And he sent out his resume with his presidency of BALSA, of course, which he should, it was an honor, and with his name spelled out, as we generally spell out our name, and he did not get the callbacks from the banks he was applying to. So with a great deal of trepidation and resentment, frankly, he decided to make his first name an initial and to be T. Anthony. He kept that he was president of BALSA on his resume, and he got lots of callbacks, and he got a great job. So it honestly wasn't that the banks didn't want a Black guy coming from law school to work in the bank. They, in fact, did. They saw he was president of BALSA. They met him. They were very, very enthusiastic. Best networker I've ever seen. It wasn't a surprise. But he was invited in with the express description that he was president of BALSA. Now, is it possible for there to be a white president of BALSA? Possible. Is that what they were thinking? Likely not. So it was the implicit reaction to his name, which has become sort of generally associated with an African-American male. It was the implicit reaction that caused the trouble, not the explicit. So that's, again, another example. I'm going to talk about nonverbal behavior in a minute because it's really important, but I do want to emphasize the doctor study for two reasons. So this was a study that has gotten a lot of attention, as it should, in the medical field. Residents were given patient descriptions of diagnostics, the same kind of forms we all fill out, where we all check the box, right, with our race and ethnicity. And the residents who had high implicit bias levels, they'd taken the IAT test, were able to diagnose the heart condition with race being irrelevant, without race having an effect, but they were significantly more likely to recommend the gold standard treatment of thrombolysis to white patients they were to Black patients. Now, I don't think anyone thinks that people go into medical school are going in with enthusiastic animus toward creating conditions in which Black people die of heart attacks. It just seems very unlikely. And the hope that I'm right was confirmed because one cohort of those residents were given in the long list of instructions, not hit over the head, but like number 17, race can sometimes be taken into account in treatment recommendation decisions. Literally, I did that quickly, and so you could barely hear me on purpose. It was buried in the instructions that race was sometimes a factor in treatment and recommendation decisions. The cohort who received that very subtle sort of reminder, they self-corrected to a person. It didn't matter what their implicit bias levels were. They self-corrected. They gave the proper recommendation and treatment. So we can and do self-correct if we know to. And that's, again, means we're not kind of bound. We're not sort of in concrete to live according to our implicit biases. This is another example that's fairly recent from 2014 and has law firms appropriately recognizing that they have to take dramatic action. So law firm partners were given, half were given a memo that they thought was from a white third-year associate named Tom Meyer who went to NYU. The other half were given identical memo, black associate went to NYU named Tom Meyer. And as you can see, the comments are quite different with respect to the identical memo. One of them is very provocative. Can't believe you went to NYU. What does that tell us? Now, these could be cherry-picked. This was not done by an academic. This was done by a consulting firm. These could be cherry-picked, these comments. But what I would direct your attention toward is the number of spelling and grammatical errors found. You'll note that when the partners thought that the associate was white, they only noticed on average, or actually it was in median, 2.9 out of the intentionally embedded 7 spelling grammatical errors. And yet when they thought the person was black, 5.8. What does that tell us? What it tells us is that once that first spelling or grammatical error was found, those partners went on eagle eye when they thought the associate was black, but barely even noticed when they thought the associate was white. So again, it was a confirmation bias issue that caused them to read the identical memo through a very different eye. And I would submit, if they'd gotten the best memo ever written and thought the associate was black, they'd be delighted. Partners have a moral and economic reasons for wanting diversity, right? Some corporations have this diversity mandate. Partners want there to be diversity, but they have these unconscious biases that clearly came into play in reading this memo. And it's somewhat ironic and obviously not, sort of scientific, but the fact that it's literally twice as many, the old adage, we have to be twice as good to be seen as the same, kind of remarkable that it's literally twice as many. So this, again, appropriately has law firms focused on, are we evaluating work fairly? We assume that we know merit when we see it, but do we? Another form of implicit bias is, and this one's very distressing, but it's important to think about. It turns out that it's often difficult for people to see the whole full range of human emotions across racial group. So this study was done shortly after Hurricane Katrina. And the question was, showing certain images, what emotions did people see when they looked at the images of people suffering in New Orleans? And the whites who had high implicit bias levels, they would see, sort of rage or anger, but they wouldn't see sorrow. So you can see strong primary emotions, but not the more subtle secondary emotions. And the people who had difficulty seeing, sort of sorrow and anguish on the face of a parent who just lost a child were less likely to offer help than those who were able to see that. And when we think about the images that were shown in the news quite frequently, we're often shown images of very strong primary emotions. Now, it doesn't matter if we live in a very diverse community and so we see people and we know them and we see those secondary emotions all the time, but most people don't live in integrated communities. So most people get their information about people from other racial and ethnic groups through the media. And so being able to see these emotions, these subtler emotions, is part of the work that we have to do. We have to be able to see across group in that way. Implicit bias also doesn't just manifest in decision making. It manifests in our body language. It turns out that if you do a study and someone has a high implicit bias level and you have someone who doesn't know the implicit bias level and you're watching an interview, the person with the high implicit bias level will stand further away, less eye contact, shorter sentences, and someone watching and hearing from the outside can spot it. That, of course, means that the person who's on the other side, the person of color who's experiencing it, they're spotting it too. And if you think of an interview panel, someone walks into an interview panel and they see someone sitting far away with their arms crossed and averting their eyes. Very difficult to give a good interview when you're met with that. Very different conditions. Very quickly, one of the reasons that it's so difficult to people to see themselves as having kind of racial bias as we understand it is it rarely is kind of animus toward other groups or hostility toward other groups, it's often just kind of a mild favoritism toward your own. The reason that you don't call the police if you're a storekeeper and you see the white kid taking the candy bar might just be, I'm going to give the kid a break. But it's that, I'm going to give the kid a break, sort of accumulated over time, over and over and over again, and not giving other kids the break that changes the outcomes that we see. But again, that doesn't feel like animus, just giving a kid a break. And you don't even quite know why you gave one kid a break and not another because you're not conscious of it. Okay, so I'm going to move a little more quickly to get to some other issues that are crucially important because I only have 15 minutes. So what can you do? I'm sure you're thinking, I hope you're thinking, what can I do? There are now a set of practices that people have engaged in that have literally reduced their bias. So it's out of University of Wisconsin, Patricia Devine, and it's multiple steps that have to be taken, sort of thought through mindfully and engaged in over time, but they've reduced bias. And they essentially have to do, the underpinning to these best practices to reduce bias are to alter the associations that you have that are negative about a particular group and replace them with counter stereotypes so that when you see someone of a particular group, you don't go into a certain mode. How do you do that? Well, first of all, recognizing who you have biases is obviously crucial. Recognizing when your behavior may be responsive to that. The typical example is, white woman, black guy walks by, she, flinches. If you see yourself doing that, you realize this is ridiculous. That I'm not going to be attacked by this man, and I've just, ruined his day because I flinched when he walked by. And that's actually an example from the study that a young white college student indicated. And beginning to create counter-stereotypical examples and having regular interaction, learning to individuate, to see difference across race, and that can be really hard. Because again, if you're afraid to look at people because you're afraid looking at people's racist, then you don't see difference because you think you're not supposed to. So again, part of this recognition that colorblindness isn't the goal is crucial. Being able to take the perspective of someone whose life is different from your own and not, well, if someone told me to get on the sidewalk, I'd just get on the sidewalk, right? That's one form of putting yourself in someone else's shoes, but that's putting myself with all my wonderful experiences with law enforcement and not someone who's had a very different set of experiences. And finally, as much interracial engagement as you can possibly have. But we can't count on ourselves being able to reduce our bias if we are in positions of power like every person in this room is. It takes too long and it's too uncertain. So what is crucial is to identify what the real trigger areas are, what the risks are that can lead to harm, and to identify bias override practices to ensure, or to the extent possible, to prevent any biases you may have from bleeding out into your behavior. So there's, sort of all sorts of very contextual ways in which this has to happen, and it really does have to be done kind of job grouping by job grouping, community by community to have them make sense. But that's really the work. Where are the risk areas? Where is the potential for bias to do harm? And what can we do to figure out the override practices that will save us and allow us to live our actual values? Okay, very quickly, racial anxiety. Now, the reason I think this is so crucial to talk about is there's a very easy reaction for people to have when they learn about something like implicit bias, and that's, oh my God, I'm racist, and everyone looking at me sees that, and to be just terrified to have any interracial interaction whatsoever because you're going to be found out as a racist. That, needless to say, is not helpful. So racial anxiety is experienced by people of all races and ethnicities, or not every person, obviously, but one can experience it, whatever your race or ethnicity. It tends to be experienced differently depending upon where you fall. If you're a person of color, you may experience some anxiety that you're going to be met with discriminatory treatment, and that's anxiety producing. And that causes your cortisol levels to go up, and it's very burdensome to walk through your day having to worry about being met with bias, and it has very profound health effects. So that's on the side of people of color, and most people of color are very aware of this. Most white people have no idea that we're experiencing racial anxiety. It's not something we're aware of at all, but we are, and it shows. So our fear isn't that we're going to be met with the same kind of bias, but instead that we're going to be seen as racist. So the goal of a training like this isn't kind of a PC, don't be racist because you're a bad person, not helpful. The goal isn't to make anyone go home and cry. The goal is for people to understand what their reactions are and to do the work to alter them. But it's really important for those, again, frankly, those of us who are white in the room, not to go into anxiety mode, because frankly, that's about us. And it leads to harm in a couple of different ways. Turns out racially anxious teachers don't give kids of color the critical feedback that they need. And that's not helpful to the students. First of all, the students know it. I actually didn't work very hard on the paper. I don't know why I got an A, but I obviously don't believe your grading methods particularly. It's felt as condescension. When parents are told, oh, your child is so well behaved and reads so well. Well, my child is in 4th grade, and yes, my child is well behaved. Why are you saying that as though you're surprised? And that's not what the white teacher meant. But again, the sort of trying to just be nice out of an anxiety isn't authentic. It's not real, and it's experienced, and it can be acute. Now, it also turns out that, and I'm going to move very quickly now to other effects. So racial anxiety tends to look a lot like bias. If you're anxious, you're kind of, again, closed off. So the anxiety method isn't helpful. So what do you do about the anxiety? Kind of similar to the bias override practices. Identify that you may experience it and figure out what are the things that I might say that could be essentially inadvertently racially condescending. And what should I be saying? What are sort of best practices that I can engage in whatever role that I'm in? And I've had judges I've talked to after hearing about this. I had one white family court judge say to me, I think this is something I've been doing for years. A white family will come in, they'll be sort of borderline, sort of corporal punishment that arguably could fall into abuse, but it, is really close to the line, so she doesn't take the child out of the home. But she speaks to the family very candidly. You have to understand, we're not saying corporal punishment is always child abuse, but you're close to the line. And we want to protect your family. We understand you love your kids. You're close to the line. But she is afraid to say that to Black families. So she says nothing, which is not helpful to those children and not helpful to that family. So again, when you're in a position of power, figuring out when your behavior isn't serving the goals that you think it's serving, when it's about protecting yourself from a perception, is really important. Finally, stereotype threat, and I'll just give one example of this because I think I'm probably seconds away from being done. So stereotype threat as a concept is the concern that you'll confirm a negative stereotype about your group. This is experienced frequently by women in the math science area, where women will literally do less well in a math test if there are men present, because unconsciously we're carrying this anxiety that we're not going to do as well. There's an interesting example of this. When Asian American women are checked their ethnicity before a math test, they do better than when they check their gender, because one is being primed and one has positive associations, the other has negative. So stereotype threat is commonly understood in the academic setting, but this can, of course, also be triggered in performance contexts as adults. The most powerful, and the one I'll end on, is Phil Goff, a colleague of mine who's at UCLA, the Center for Police Equity. He's done multiple studies of police departments trying to understand the underpinning of what leads to excessive stops and frisks and excessive uses of force. He found, and this is not that surprising, there are some, as we know, explicitly biased police officers out there. Some of them tell him so. He's a Black man. They just come out and tell him. Explicitly biased police officers are the most likely to have disproportionate stops. But interestingly, they are not more likely than anyone else to engage in excessive use of force, which is sort of surprising. So who is? It's not the implicitly biased police officers either. There are two factors that correlate with excessive use of force. One is masculinity anxiety. And that probably makes sense, right? We're all going to nod about that one. How many of you watched 21 Jump Street when you were young? Johnny Depp on the first day, someone calls him a pretty boy and he beats the hell out of him. Masculinity anxiety. So that one makes sense. The other one, and of course, who is seen as most masculine? Who are the stereotypes hyper-masculinized? Black men. The second one is a little more surprising. It's anxiety about being thought of as racist. that is highly correlated to excessive use of force. Now, why would that be? Professor Goff's theory on this is that police officers have two sources of authority, moral and physical. And if a police officer is concerned that his or her moral authority isn't recognized because the person thinks they're racist, Professor Goff hypothesizes they are more apt to fall back on force. Which is why the goal of any of these trainings can't be, let's make police officers feel like we all think they're racist. That is not accurate, it's not fair, and it doesn't do the work. So what Professor Goff has done with these stereotype threat vulnerable police officers is they've identified what are best policing practices that are clearly non-racist. And they've identified the practices and they've taught the practices as that. These are non-racist police practices. If you engage in these practices in these ways, you are not racist. It doesn't matter what anyone's calling you. You are not racist. And they brought the excessive force levels down tremendously. So I will conclude by saying intentions are sort of necessary, obviously not sufficient, and this work is complex, it's hard, and it requires very situational, context-specific thinking about where the risks are, what the practices need to be, and how we can all come together to achieve clearly the world we all want to achieve. Thank you all so much.
We're going to take the